sun is high. To go there, everything on this is project.
We just woke up from a coma. Not.
The ship.
The story opens in complete silence, with a lone spacecraft gliding through the vast emptiness of space. At first, everything appears lifeless, until the faint twitch of an eye reveals that someone inside is still breathing. That man is Ryland Grace. A calm, mechanical voice echoes through the ship, asking him a basic question, "What's 2 plus 2?" But there's no reply. The system immediately flags the failed response, signaling that something is very wrong. Slowly, Ryland begins to regain awareness. His vision clears just enough for him to notice two figures nearby, Yao Lei, the mission's captain, and another crew member. Neither of them moves. Neither of them is alive. The realization hits him all at once. He's alone, completely alone, floating in deep space with no understanding of how he got there, his mind clouded and unstable. Panic creeps in as he tries to make sense of his surroundings. Nothing feels familiar. A microscope sits nearby, but he has no clue why it's there, or what he's supposed to do with it. Forcing himself to stay calm, Ryland begins exploring the ship step by step, searching for any clue that might explain his situation. He attempts to speak to the captain, hoping for some sign of life, but the ship's AI confirms what he already fears. The captain is gone, the others too. He is the sole survivor. Desperate for connection, he tries to contact Earth. Instead of comfort, he receives a chilling piece of information. The ship has been traveling for 11 years, 10 months, 14 days, and 6 hours. The sheer magnitude of that time crushes him. It's far beyond anything he can process. He looks for the sun, something familiar, something grounding, but it's nowhere to be found. It's as if he's been removed from everything he's ever known, cut off from home, from humanity, from reality itself. Trying to regain control, Ryland turns to logic. He examines the ship's fuel, attempting to calculate their distance, their trajectory, anything that might help him understand where he is. But the numbers don't make sense. The calculations refuse to align. His thoughts feel fractured, like pieces of a puzzle that won't fit together. Worse still, he can't remember how he ended up here. Then slowly, fragments of memory begin to surface. Blurry at first, like images seen through fog. He sees himself standing in a classroom, speaking to a group of students. He used to be a teacher, a science teacher. In one of those moments, his students ask about something called the Petrova line. Ryland explains that a scientist named Irina Petrova discovered a strange phenomenon, a streak of red light stretching from the sun toward Venus. This mysterious beam became known as the Petrova line. Curious, humanity sent a probe to investigate. What they found was terrifying. An unknown organism, something alive, appeared to be feeding on the sun's energy, slowly draining it. If left unchecked, it could reduce Earth's temperature by 10 to 15 degrees over the next 3 decades, threatening all life on the planet. The students grow anxious, asking the question everyone is afraid to say out loud: are they going to die? Ryland, masking his own uncertainty, reassures them. Everything will be fine, he tells them. There's nothing to worry about. Back in the present, those memories begin to feel real. They're not just dreams, they're pieces of his past, slowly returning. Accepting his isolation, Ryland begins adjusting to life aboard the ship. He trims his overgrown beard, searches for food, and starts organizing everything around him. Among the ship's belongings, he finds photographs of the crew, faces that now belong to the dead. The weight of loneliness presses down on him harder with each passing moment. When he opens his personal storage, he finds items from his previous life. Each object triggers more memories, slowly rebuilding his identity, but the isolation is suffocating. At one point, just to cope, he finds himself dancing with a small toy, anything to feel less alone. Day after day, he writes notes, trying to keep his thoughts in order, trying not to lose himself completely. More memories begin to return. He recalls meeting Eva Stratt, the leader of the Petrova project. She sought him out personally, explaining that despite his damaged reputation, after refusing to retract a controversial scientific claim, the world still needed him. During their conversation, a man named Carl arrives, the head of security for the project. His presence alone makes it clear that this situation is far more serious than it seems. Eva reveals that samples connected to the Petrova line have made their way to Earth. She needs Ryland to analyze them, to understand exactly what they are. That's when the true gravity of the situation becomes undeniable. The sun is dying. With no time to waste, Ryland is brought into the project and assigned to study the samples. He's warned that they're extremely dangerous, which is why he's the only one allowed to handle them directly. Carefully, methodically, he begins his work. Hours turn into days as he observes the samples under strict conditions. Eventually, he notices something unusual. They move. At first, his explanation doesn't land well with the others. It sounds overly detailed, even tedious, but Ryland persists, pushing forward with his observations until he makes a breakthrough. The sample isn't just reacting, it's alive. The room fills with excitement at the discovery. But the moment is short-lived. Within minutes, the cell dies. Instead of giving in to frustration, Ryland shifts his focus. If it can live, then it can be kept alive. He begins studying its composition, discovering that it's primarily made of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, with a structure heavily based on water. Even more intriguing, it emits a faint red glow when it moves, matching the exact wavelength of the Petrova line. That detail sparks a critical question in his mind. If these organisms originate near the sun, why are they traveling toward Venus? When he brings this up, Eva Stratt shuts him down. She explains that hundreds of biologists across the globe are already working on the problem and assures him that answers will come eventually. Just like that, Ryland is pushed out of the project. But walking away isn't something he's willing to do. Despite having only 3 remaining samples, after already losing one, Eva Stratt decides to bring Grace back into the fold. In the present, Ryland continues piecing together his fractured memories, each one helping him better understand how he ended up on this mission. Another flash from the past surfaces. Dr. Ryland Grace is in discussion with Carl, the security officer assigned to him. As they talk, Grace shares a thought that's been bothering him. If these organisms originate near the sun, why are they heading toward Venus? Could it be something about the atmosphere? But that idea doesn't quite fit. Venus is mostly carbon dioxide, which only deepens the mystery. Those unanswered questions push him further. Determined to figure out how this substance, astrophage, actually behaves, Grace decides to run his own experiments. Lacking proper funding and resources, he relies on Carl's access to help him acquire the necessary equipment. Together, they piece together a makeshift setup designed to mimic the extreme environments of both the Sun and Venus. As the experiment begins, something unexpected happens. The astrophage escapes containment. Even in that moment, Grace doesn't panic. Thinking quickly, he recalls its behavior and makes a bold move. He shuts off the lights. The reaction is immediate. The samples become easier to track, allowing them to recover 3 units. But then they notice something strange. There are 4. For a brief moment, they just stare at it, trying to process what they're seeing. Then it clicks. Without hesitation, Grace contacts Eva Strat, barely containing his excitement. He jokes that he and Carl have just become parents because the astrophage has reproduced. Soon after, Grace is brought before a group of scientists. This time, he's introduced not as a controversial figure, but as the man who discovered how these organisms multiply. He explains that by recreating Venus-like conditions, he uncovered the reason behind their movement. It's not random at all. They're drawn to Venus because it provides the perfect environment for reproduction. The room buzzes with energy. When the scientists ask how they can accelerate that process, Grace doesn't immediately grasp the full implications of their question. That's when Eva Strat steps in. She grants him full clearance to Project Hail Mary. From that moment, everything changes. Grace finally sees the bigger picture. The issue isn't limited to Earth's sun. Other stars are being affected as well. But there's one exception, a star called Tau Ceti, located about 11.9 light-years away. Unlike the others, it shows no signs of being drained. That anomaly becomes humanity's last hope. The plan is bold, almost impossible. Build a spacecraft capable of reaching Tau Ceti and uncovering why it's unaffected. But the biggest challenge isn't constructing the ship, it's powering it. The solution lies in astrophage itself. These microscopic organisms can store enormous amounts of energy, making them the ideal fuel source. With that, the mission becomes theoretically possible, a ship that can accelerate to a significant fraction of the speed of light. But there's a harsh reality attached to it. There won't be enough fuel for a return journey. Any data collected will have to be sent back using small probes. The crew, however, will almost certainly never come home. That realization weighs heavily on Grace. He asks the obvious question, who's going to volunteer for this? Are they essentially signing up for a one-way trip? Eva Strat doesn't sugarcoat it. Most likely, yes. She explains that if they choose to do nothing, the outcome will be far worse. As Earth cools, ecosystems will collapse, food shortages will spiral out of control, and society itself could crumble under the pressure. Compared to that, this mission is humanity's best chance. She also outlines the requirements. Only 3 people are needed, a pilot, an engineer, and a scientist. Back in the present, Ryland, now fully aware of his situation, stands alone, looking at the photographs of his fallen crewmates. His voice carries a quiet sadness as he admits he wishes he'd had the chance to know them better. He even points out their silly expressions in the pictures, trying to find some comfort in those small moments. Then softly he says goodbye to the engineer, speaking as if she might still hear him. He acknowledges that they were good people, people who deserved more than this, and promises that he won't let their sacrifice go to waste. Not long after, the ship alerts him that he's nearing the orbit of Tau Ceti. The onboard observation system activates, allowing him to analyze the surrounding star system through spectroscopic data. As he scans the area, something familiar appears, a Petrova line, but this time it's different. Instead of draining the star, it seems stable. Still, something else catches his attention. A massive object appears within the system. Realizing the potential danger, Grace tries to maneuver away, but no matter where he goes, the object follows him. There's no escape. Eventually, he stops resisting and steps away from the controls. Moments later, the unknown craft launches something toward his ship. Grace has no idea what it is. A signal, a device, a weapon. For a split second, he even considers the possibility that it's a bomb. He attempts to activate defensive systems, but quickly realizes the truth. The Hail Mary was never built for combat. There are no weapons, no shields. The only way to deal with the incoming object is to intercept it manually. That means going outside. Even as hesitation creeps in, he doesn't have a choice. He's forced into action. Using everything he's got, he exits the ship and manages to catch the object mid-flight. Somehow he makes it back inside safely, but there's another problem. He can't open it. That's when a memory resurfaces. He recalls a discussion between Eva Stratt and another scientist about how certain tools wouldn't function properly in Tau Ceti's environment due to gravity differences. The solution back then was simple: adapt to the conditions. Taking that idea to heart, Grace makes a bold decision. He shuts down the ship's artificial gravity. With the artificial gravity disabled, everything shifts, and just like that, the device finally opens. Inside, Ryland doesn't find a weapon or a threat. Instead, there's something far more intriguing: a map. It appears to indicate the origin of whoever sent it. Realizing what this could mean, Grace quickly marks Earth's location on the map and sends the object back. Hours pass, then it returns. This time, the response is unmistakable. The alien vessel deploys a tunnel-like structure, extending directly toward the Hail Mary. The moment it connects, the entrance is swallowed in darkness. Fear creeps in, but curiosity pushes him forward. Slowly, Grace opens the hatch and steps into the unknown. As he moves through the tunnel, everything around him feels surreal. When he reaches the other side, he's left in awe. The alien ship is unlike anything he's ever imagined. The technology is far more advanced than anything humans have created. He stares at the strange materials, trying to understand what he's seeing, something that, until recently, would have seemed impossible. Then suddenly something moves. An arm-like structure extends toward him. It interacts with him in a way that's both strange and oddly deliberate, guiding his arm along with a representation of himself and his ship. The message isn't entirely clear, but the intention feels obvious. Go back. With no better option, Grace listens. He retreats to his own ship, once again alone, but not for long. Soon after, he notices something unsettling. The smaller alien craft begins mimicking him. Every movement he makes, every adjustment, every shift is mirrored perfectly. It's not random, it's deliberate. Curiosity takes over. Determined to understand, Grace prepares to cross the tunnel again. This time, he brings something with him, a crude attempt at communication. Using Raman, he's crafted a small model of the alien ship. As he enters their vessel again, the creature approaches. And just like before, it copies him. Every motion, every step, it's learning. Despite how strange it is, Grace doesn't feel fear. Instead, he moves closer, cautiously observing. That's when he realizes something even more unsettling. The being has no recognizable face, no eyes, no expression, and yet it's clearly aware. Step by step, he pushes past the discomfort. Slowly, carefully, he begins to establish the first fragile connection. The alien gestures toward another object, a second offering. Grace opens it. He doesn't understand what it is at first, but out of instinct, he expresses gratitude anyway. As he turns to leave, something catches his attention. The structure of the object. It resembles a molecular model. 2 rings, 8 components. Oxygen, that's when it clicks. The alien just gave him breathable air. Even with that realization, hesitation grips him. If he's wrong, removing his helmet could be fatal. He pauses, counts the seconds, weighs the risk. Then he takes the leap. He removes his helmet, and nothing happens. He's alive. That single moment changes everything. Grace understands that if they're going to solve the mystery behind the Petrova line and save their worlds, they need to communicate. He starts simple. Using a measuring tape, he begins establishing patterns, numbers, sequences, logic. At first, the alien doesn't understand, but Grace doesn't stop. He keeps trying, refining his approach, adjusting his methods. He also realizes something crucial. The alien exists in an ammonia-based environment, completely incompatible with human life. Either atmosphere would be lethal to the other. Still, he introduces himself. Grace, the alien, struggles to replicate the sound. Eventually, it settles on something close enough, Rocky, and just like that, the name sticks. Day by day, they build a basic language. Grace teaches simple concepts, yes, no, numbers, while Rocky responds in his own structured way. Every interaction becomes a lesson, every mistake a step forward. Grace documents everything, planning to send it back to Earth someday. Even when communication breaks down, he adapts, using drawings, gestures, visual cues, anything that helps bridge the gap between 2 completely different forms of life. Eventually, they reach a breakthrough. They exchange critical information. Both of them come to the same realization. Their stars are dying for the same reason. This isn't just Earth's problem, it's universal. Using a translation system he gradually develops, Grace builds a shared vocabulary of over 200 words. With that foundation, he shows Rocky a sample of astrophage. Rocky reacts instantly. It's a threat on his world too. Grace then asks about Rocky's crew. The answer hits hard. There were 23 of them, all gone. Rocky doesn't fully understand what happened, only that he's the last one left. In return, Rocky asks about Grace's ship, 3 crew members. 2 are dead now, both of them stand in the same reality, alone, but also something more essential. They are the last chance their worlds have, and so they make a decision. They'll work together. Rocky wants to save his star. Grace wants to save his. In that moment, an unlikely alliance is formed, two beings from entirely different worlds, united by the same goal. As time passes, their communication becomes smoother, more natural. Grace experiments with different audio patterns in his system until he finds one that Rocky can understand clearly, giving them a much more effective way to talk. Even with all this progress, there's still one thing missing. Grace still doesn't remember how he ended up on this mission. Rocky, however, reassures him. He believes the answer will come back to him eventually. Before turning in, Grace tells Rocky he's going to sleep. That's when Rocky becomes uneasy. He explains that in his experience, he's watched over his own crew for a long time, and none of them ever woke up. Because of what Rocky just shared, he makes a decision. He's not going to sleep. Instead, he'll stay awake and keep watch over Grace. That's when Grace begins to understand something fundamental about Rocky's species. They never leave each other vulnerable. Whenever one individual rests, another remains alert, ready to act at the slightest sign of danger. It's not just habit, it's survival. If someone is at risk, they must be woken immediately. There's always a guardian. No one is left unprotected. That realization lingers with Grace. Another memory begins to surface. In the past, Eva Stratt introduces him to the crew selected for the mission. As they talk, something unsettling becomes clear. Every one of them has already accepted their likely fate. Not only that, they were even given the option to choose how they would die. And yet, they still chose to go. Despite the weight of that reality, they continue preparing. As part of the mission, a system has been developed to combat astrophage, an infrared-based device designed to lure them in and then annihilate them with intense radiation. It's necessary. Astrophage stores massive amounts of energy. Even the smallest quantity can release enough heat to melt through solid metal in an instant. When the system is tested, it leaves no doubt. These organisms are incredibly dangerous. Back in the present, Grace is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He never wanted to be here. Unlike the others, he didn't step forward willingly, ready to sacrifice everything. But none of that matters now. He's already out here, millions of miles from home, with no way back. There's only one option left: keep going. Together with Rocky, he commits to doing whatever it takes to save both their worlds. As time passes, Rocky begins adapting more easily to working alongside Grace. To safely exist near him, he creates a small ammonia-filled enclosure, a controlled sphere that allows him to approach without putting himself in danger. Now they can share space more directly. Rocky even starts reorganizing parts of the ship, arranging tools and equipment according to his own logical system. At first, it feels strange to Grace, but over time, they find a rhythm. A way of working together that makes sense despite their differences. Still, some of Rocky's habits are unusual, especially when it comes to how he eats. During their ongoing research, Grace stumbles onto something troubling. Rocky's species has no understanding of radiation. That realization leads to a chilling possibility. The astrophage had been stored near Rocky's work area. If radiation was involved, his entire crew could have been unknowingly exposed. That might explain what happened to them. It's not just a theory, it could be the truth behind their deaths. As their work continues, Grace explains that the Petrova line isn't fixed in place, it shifts constantly. To properly study it, they'll need to use planetary gravity, positioning themselves carefully within its path. Later, during a quieter moment, Grace decides to show Rocky something different. He runs a simulation of Earth. For Rocky, the experience is overwhelming. The visuals, the concept, it's all foreign. But as they talk, the conversation takes an unexpected turn. Grace notices something. Rocky seems lonely. When he brings it up, Rocky admits that he doesn't currently have a partner, though he once did. He recalls how she used to tell him that he was always lost in thought, disconnected from reality. At the time, he didn't fully understand. But eventually, he realized she was right. Now, she's moved on. Curious, Grace asks how long they were together. The answer surprises him: 186.3 years. And even after all that time, Rocky feels like it wasn't enough. Refocusing on their mission, they locate a nearby planet suitable for testing. It becomes their experimental ground. There, they begin trying different methods to eliminate astrophage, searching for a solution that could save both of their civilizations. Another memory rises to the surface. Before launch, the crew gathers together, fully aware of what lies ahead. Instead of despair, they choose to celebrate. They laugh, sing, and embrace the time they have left, balancing joy with quiet acceptance. Grace, however, feels out of place. The atmosphere doesn't sit right with him. He eventually approaches Eva Stratt and asks if she feels the same. He points out that she hasn't joined in the celebration. She tells him she can sing. and despite everything, the risk, the uncertainty, she believes the mission will succeed. Her faith in God gives her confidence. A little later, she begins to sing. It's a simple moment, but it changes something. For the first time, Grace smiles. The tension eases, even if only briefly. Back in the present, Grace shows Rocky a star he's been analyzing, which he casually refers to as 1E. Rocky immediately critiques the name, comparing it to something equally dull like Tau Ceti E, clearly unimpressed. So Grace decides to make things more interesting. He turns the moment into a playful demonstration, even adding flashing red lights for dramatic effect. In the same spirit, he gives Rocky's former partner a human name, Adrian. They both agree to use that name for the planet they're studying, but as their research deepens, Grace arrives at a troubling conclusion. If astrophage travels to reproduce, there should be far more of it. Something doesn't add up. Digging deeper, he uncovers something unexpected. There's other life on the planet. Cells unlike astrophage, more familiar, more comparable to life from their own worlds, and more importantly, these organisms behave differently. They act as predators, they hunt astrophage, they destroy it. And just like that, a new possibility begins to emerge. That discovery changes everything. Grace realizes the solution isn't about wiping out astrophage directly, it's about using what naturally hunts it. The life forms from the planet they've named Adrian might be the answer. If they can transport these organisms back to their respective worlds, they could stop the threat at its source. As he records his findings, Rocky joins in, curious and engaged. He even starts contributing to the logs, trying to understand how they might relay all this information back to Earth. Then he asks a simple question. Why not just explain everything once you return home? Grace pauses, and finally tells him the truth. The ship has enough fuel to reach Earth, but not enough to make a return journey. He isn't going back. Rocky's reaction is immediate. Anger, disbelief, he reminds Grace that he said he would return, that this was the plan, but Grace doesn't argue. He speaks calmly, almost accepting his fate. He tells Rocky that what they've experienced together, this unlikely friendship, this mission, it's been enough. If this is where his story ends, then so be it. He even reassures him that he has enough supplies to survive for a few more years, but Rocky refuses to accept that, not for him. If there's any way to change that outcome, then it has to be done. He asks Grace how much astrophage he would need to complete the mission. Grace estimates around 2 million kilograms. Without hesitation, Rocky offers to help. Even if it means returning to his own planet years later than planned. He admits something painful. He watched every member of his crew die, powerless to stop it, and he refuses to go through that again, not with Grace. If there's a way to save him, he'll take it. That moment hits Grace harder than anything else. He breaks. Tears fill his eyes as the weight of it all finally sinks in. Without saying much, they embrace two beings from entirely different worlds, bound by something deeper than words. And then they get back to work. Together, they begin gathering the materials they need. But during one of these collection missions, things go wrong. Grace heads out to retrieve a collector, but loses control in the process. The device slips away, drifting out of reach. Somehow, he manages to grab it and make it back inside, but the situation has already taken a turn for the worse. Being so close to the source begins to affect the ship. Systems start failing, fuel begins leaking. In a frantic attempt to stabilize everything, Grace ejects a compartment, but realizes too late that he's released the wrong module. When he tries to correct the mistake, his movements cause even more damage. Before he knows it, he's stuck in the pilot's seat, completely unable to move. Seeing the danger, Rocky makes a choice. He leaves the safety of his ammonia-filled environment. The moment he enters Grace's atmosphere, it begins harming him. His body starts to break down, slowly deteriorating under conditions it can't survive, but he keeps going. Despite the pain, despite the risk, he saves Grace. He gets him out, he gets him to safety, and then everything fades. As Grace regains consciousness, another memory comes rushing back. This time it's the truth. There had been an accident, his fault. A miscalculation during one of his experiments led to a catastrophic explosion. The facility was destroyed, and the entire team assigned to the mission was killed, except for two. They needed a replacement, fast. Grace wasn't chosen because he volunteered. He was chosen because he was the only one left who understood astrophage. He wasn't trained for space. He wasn't prepared, but he fit the requirements. And perhaps most importantly, he had no close family, no responsibilities keeping him on Earth. He was given just 3 hours to decide. Back in the present, Grace wakes up, weak, disoriented, but alive. He notices markings along the floor, left behind by Rocky. Following them, he finds him. Rocky has made it back to his ammonia environment, but barely. He's in terrible condition, alive but unconscious. That's when Grace realizes what's at stake. If Rocky isn't watched over, if no one is there when he wakes, he might never wake up at all. so Grace does what Rocky once did for him. He stays awake, watching, waiting, taking care of him. At the same time, he continues recording logs, documenting everything he's tried to keep Rocky alive, even constructing a heat source to stabilize his condition. In one recording, his tone shifts. It sounds like a final message. No matter what happens, he says, both of their worlds must be saved. Then he returns to work. He combines the Adrian-based organisms with collected astrophage samples, and it works. The astrophage begins to die. His theory was right. He names the organism Tomoba, a natural predator of astrophage. Excited, he turns to Rocky, still unconscious, and tells him they've done it. They've found the solution. Now they finally have what they need. There's just one step left. They need to produce enough astrophage for the journey and deliver the Tomoba to their respective planets. But Grace can't do that part alone. He needs Rocky. Without him, there's no way to transport the solution to his world. Exhausted beyond limits, Grace finally gives in. He falls asleep. Sometime later, Rocky wakes up. Their reunion is silent but powerful. No words, just relief. They move toward each other and embrace. Grace shows him the breeding system he designed, and it's working flawlessly. For the first time, there's real hope, so they celebrate. A small, quiet moment, just the two of them. As a sign of friendship, Grace gives Rocky a few gifts, a laptop filled with information about Earth and a small ball modeled after him. Rocky is deeply moved. He says he'll never forget him, though he admits, almost awkwardly, that he didn't bring anything in return. Grace doesn't mind. Instead, he asks for something else, to see Rocky's ship. Equipped with protective gear designed for ammonia conditions, he steps into Rocky's environment. The alien technology around him is incredible, far beyond anything he's ever seen. And in that moment, another memory hits him, hard. The memory hits him with full force. Grace is standing in front of Eva Stratt, his voice unsteady as he finally admits the truth. He can't do it. He can't go through with the mission. He tries to justify himself, explaining that even though billions of lives are at stake, even though the planet will suffer catastrophic losses over the next few decades, he still doesn't have the courage to step onto that ship. Eva Stratt doesn't flinch. Calm, controlled, and unwavering, she tells him there is no alternative. This isn't a choice anymore, it's a necessity. But Grace doesn't move. Seeing that he won't change his mind, she makes a decision. A harsh one, she orders security to detain him. Without warning, he's taken into custody and placed into a medically induced coma, far earlier than planned. And just like that, against his will, Rylan Grace is sent into space. Back in the present, standing inside Rocky's ship, all of it finally makes sense. The confusion, the missing memories, the feeling that something never quite added up. He never chose this. But now, none of that matters. He's here. And everything depends on what he does next. When the time comes to part ways, the moment is quiet, but heavy. Rocky tells him that when he sleeps again, there won't be anyone watching over him this time. Still, he calls Grace something else too, the bravest being he's ever known, the only one. They say goodbye in their own way, touching arms, a gesture that now carries meaning far beyond words, a bond formed across worlds. Then they separate, each heading toward their own destination. Grace prepares himself for the long journey ahead, 4 years and 11 months alone in space. But before long, something goes wrong. The ship's systems detect an irregularity. A problem. As he investigates, his heart sinks. There's been a breach. The Tomoba has escaped containment, and it's changing, adapting, evolving. The realization hits him instantly. If these organisms consume his fuel, the ship will fail. And even if that doesn't kill him outright, the radiation exposure will. It won't be quick. It'll be slow, painful, and completely alone. At that moment, Grace faces the most difficult choice of his life. He can't do both. He can't save Earth and Rocky at the same time. It's one or the other. Before making his decision, he focuses on what matters most. He prepares and launches a set of probes back toward Earth, loaded with everything. His research, the data, samples of Tomoba, and every detail of what he and Rocky discovered together. Humanity now has a chance. And with that done, he chooses. He's not going home. He turns the ship around. His mission changes. Now it's about saving Rocky. After a long, dangerous journey, he finally tracks down Rocky's vessel. Drawing closer, he initiates contact. Moments stretch out, tense and uncertain. Then Rocky appears. They've found each other again. Meanwhile, far away on Earth, Eva Stratt receives the incoming data. The probes arrive, carrying Grace's work, proof that a solution exists. The fight isn't over, but hope has returned. Some time later, the story takes a different turn. Grace is no longer drifting through space. He's living on Rocky's home planet, Arid. The world is strange, unfamiliar, yet somehow welcoming. Rocky and his partner, the one Grace named Adrian, have gone out of their way to recreate elements of Earth's environment, allowing him to exist there more comfortably. It's not home, but it's close enough. And then they offer him something unexpected, a role, a purpose. They ask him to teach, to become a science instructor for their species. Grace accepts, and just like that, his journey comes full circle. Not as a hero returning home to applause, but as a teacher, sharing knowledge, guiding others, finding meaning in a place he never imagined he'd belong. And in that quiet, unexpected ending, Ryland Grace finally finds his purpose. There's something rare about a film that doesn't just entertain you, but actually lifts you. Project Hail Mary is that kind of movie. From the very beginning, it makes a clear promise. This isn't going to be a cold, distant, purely intellectual piece of science fiction. It's something warmer, something more human. A story that understands that even when you're dealing with the death of stars and the fate of entire civilizations, what truly matters is connection. And that tone is what defines the entire experience. This is a life-affirming sci-fi film, one that leans heavily into optimism at a time when most stories in the genre choose darkness, cynicism, or existential dread. Instead of overwhelming you with despair, it quietly insists on hope. Not naive hope, but something earned through struggle, through fear, and through the kind of choices that test who you really are. There's a constant balancing act happening here. On one hand, the stakes couldn't be higher. Humanity is on the brink. The universe itself feels unstable, and the scale is almost incomprehensible. But on the other hand, the film never loses sight of its emotional core. It doesn't get lost in its own size, because underneath all the science, all the danger, all the vastness of space, this is a story about companionship. It's about what happens when two beings, completely different in every conceivable way, find common ground. It's about trust forming where it shouldn't be possible. It's about humor appearing in the middle of fear. And more than anything, it's about the simple, deeply human need to not face the unknown alone. What makes the tone so effective is how naturally it blends these elements together. The humor isn't forced. It doesn't feel like a break from the tension. It feels like a response to it. The kind of humor that comes from survival, from awkwardness, from trying to make sense of something bigger than yourself. You'll find yourself laughing in moments that don't undercut the stakes, but actually make them feel more real. And then, almost without warning, the film shifts. It hits you with sincerity, moments that slow everything down, moments where the spectacle fades into the background and what's left is something much quieter, something that lands emotionally in a way you don't expect. It's in those scenes where the film really reveals what it's about, not just saving the world, but understanding why it's worth saving in the first place. There's also a sense of wonder running through everything. Not just visual wonder, though there's plenty of that, but emotional wonder, the feeling of discovery, of encountering something new and trying to make sense of it. The film captures that childlike curiosity without ever feeling childish. It invites you to look at the unknown not with fear, but with openness. And that's where its identity becomes clear. This isn't a film trying to impress you with how dark or complex it can be. It's not trying to push you away or challenge you with bleakness. Instead, it pulls you in. It makes you care. It reminds you that even in the most extreme circumstances, kindness, cooperation, and courage still matter. That's why it feels so accessible. You don't need to be a hardcore science fiction fan to connect with it. You don't need to understand every technical detail or scientific explanation. Because at its core, the film speaks a universal language: friendship, sacrifice, and the quiet bravery it takes to do something not because you want to, but because it's the right thing to do. And by the time it's over, what stays with you isn't just the scale of the story. It's the feeling, that warmth, that optimism, that rare sense that you've just watched something that believes in people, believes in connection, believes that even in the vast emptiness of space, we're never truly alone if we're willing to reach out. And honestly, in today's landscape, that might be the most powerful thing this film does. At its core, Project Hail Mary is built on one of the most terrifying ideas science fiction can offer. What if the stars started dying? Not exploding, not collapsing, just slowly fading out, and with them, everything we depend on. The film wastes no time establishing this threat. Something unseen is draining energy from stars across the galaxy, including our own sun. And unlike the kind of disasters we're used to in blockbuster cinema, this isn't immediate chaos. It's something quieter, more insidious. A slow death, an extinction that creeps closer day by day. Crops fail, temperatures drop. Entire ecosystems begin to collapse. And suddenly, humanity isn't dealing with a distant cosmic mystery anymore. It's facing a countdown. A future where, in just a few years, life on Earth becomes unsustainable. That's the scale we're dealing with. Not a city, not a country, everything. And in the middle of this crisis, the story narrows its focus in a way that's surprisingly intimate. Because instead of following governments, armies, or global systems trying to solve the problem, the film centers everything on one man, Ryland Grace. A scientist who, at least on the surface, doesn't look like humanity's best hope. He's not a trained astronaut. He's not a heroic figure in the traditional sense. And yet, he's the one sent into the unknown. His mission is almost impossible by design. Travel across interstellar space to Tau Ceti, the one star that hasn't been affected, find out why it's different, understand what's happening, and somehow figure out how to stop it before Earth runs out of time. No backup plan, no rescue, just a one-way journey into the dark. And what makes this premise so effective isn't just the scale, it's the isolation. Space in this film isn't just a setting, it's a constant reminder of how small and vulnerable the mission really is. There's no margin for error, no room for comfort. Every decision matters because there's no one else coming to fix things if something goes wrong. That pressure is always there. Even in quieter moments, even when the film leans into humor or curiosity, you never forget what's at stake. The survival of an entire species rests on a handful of discoveries, a series of experiments, and the ability of one person to keep going when everything around him is uncertain. But here's where the film does something interesting. It doesn't rely purely on tension or dread to carry that weight. Instead, it builds its stakes through understanding, through problem-solving, through trial and error, through the slow process of figuring out something no one has ever encountered before. The danger isn't just external, it's intellectual. It's about whether humanity is capable of understanding the problem before time runs out, and that makes every breakthrough feel earned. Every small step forward feels like a victory, not because it solves everything, but because it pushes the mission just a little bit closer to success. You start to realize that this isn't a story about one big heroic moment. It's about persistence, about continuing to search for answers when the outcome is uncertain, about facing something incomprehensibly large and refusing to give up anyway. And that's what gives the premise its emotional weight. Because beneath the science, beneath the spectacle, what you're really watching is a question unfold. What does it take to save the world when you're completely alone? Or maybe more importantly, what does it take to try, even when you're not sure you can? By grounding a galaxy-wide crisis in such a personal, isolated mission, Project Hail Mary transforms its premise from something abstract into something deeply human. The fate of Earth isn't just a concept. It becomes a responsibility. And from that point on, every decision, every discovery, every risk carries a weight that you can feel all the way through to the end. One of the smartest things Project Hail Mary does isn't just what story it tells, it's how it tells it. Because this isn't a straightforward, linear journey from point A to point B instead, the film builds its narrative like a puzzle, one that slowly assembles itself piece by piece, pulling you deeper into the mystery as it goes. We begin in isolation. Rylan Grace wakes up alone on a spacecraft, disoriented, confused, and with no clear understanding of how he got there. There's no immediate exposition dump, no guiding hand explaining the situation. Just fragments, gaps, questions, and that uncertainty becomes the engine of the story. From that moment on, the film splits itself into two parallel timelines, one unfolding in the present aboard the spacecraft, and the other gradually revealed through flashbacks to Earth. But what's important is that these flashbacks don't just fill in background information. They're timed, strategically placed. Each return to Earth comes exactly when the story needs it, when a piece of context will deepen what's happening in the present, when a revelation will change how we see Grace, or when a moment of clarity can reframe everything we thought we understood. It's not just backstory, it's progression. As Grace begins to recover his memory, we recover it with him. The film doesn't rush this process. It lets the realization unfold naturally, allowing us to experience the same confusion, the same discovery, and eventually the same understanding. And that shared perspective is what makes the structure so effective, because instead of watching a character who already knows everything, we're learning alongside him. Every answer feels earned. Every revelation feels like a step forward, not just in the plot, but in our connection to the character. At the same time, the present-day storyline never loses momentum. On the spacecraft, the narrative is driven by immediate challenges, problems that need solving, decisions that can't wait, and situations that constantly evolve. It's active, tense, and grounded in the now. Then the film cuts back to Earth, to the past, to the moments that led Grace here in the first place. And suddenly, what seemed like a simple survival story becomes something more layered. We start to see the bigger picture, the choices, the pressures, the circumstances that shaped this mission, and the man at its center. What's remarkable is how seamlessly these two timelines feed into each other. The past informs the present reframes the past. And together they create a rhythm that keeps the film constantly engaging. There's always something new to uncover, always another piece of the story waiting to click into place. Even structurally, the film mirrors its own themes: discovery, understanding, connection. Just like Grace is trying to solve a problem in space, the audience is piecing together a story in real time. And as those pieces come together, the narrative becomes clearer, richer, and more emotionally resonant. Of course, this kind of structure comes with its own risks. If the balance isn't right, it can feel disjointed. If the timing is off, it can break immersion. And for some viewers, the constant shifting between timelines may feel uneven, especially when the pacing slows in certain sections. But when it works, it really works. Because instead of telling you everything up front, the film trusts you. It trusts you to stay engaged, to follow along, to connect the dots. And in doing so, it transforms what could have been a simple survival narrative into something more dynamic, something that unfolds, rather than just plays out. By the time the two timelines fully converge, the story feels complete in a way that's both logical and emotional. You understand not just what's happening, but why it matters, and that's the power of its structure. It doesn't just tell a story, it reveals it, one moment, one memory, one realization at a time. If there's one element that Project Hail Mary absolutely depends on, it's Ryan Gosling, because this film doesn't just feature him, it leans on him. He is the center of gravity for almost everything that happens. For long stretches, he's alone on screen, carrying the narrative without support, without constant dialogue, without the usual ensemble to bounce off of. And in a setup like that, there's nowhere to hide. Either the performance works or the entire film collapses, and somehow, Gosling makes it look effortless. What makes his performance so compelling isn't just that he holds your attention, it's how he does it. He doesn't play Ryland Grace as a traditional hero. There's no forced bravado, no exaggerated confidence. Instead, he leans into something much more human: confusion, anxiety, curiosity. You see a man trying to understand what's happening around him just as much as you are, and that shared uncertainty immediately pulls you in. You're not watching someone who has all the answers. You're watching someone figure things out in real time. And that's where Gosling's range really starts to show. He moves seamlessly between tones. One moment, he's delivering sharp, natural humor that feels completely unforced, almost like it's just slipping out of him without effort. The next, he's grounded in something quieter, more vulnerable. You can see the weight of the situation settling in, the realization of what's at stake, the pressure of being completely alone, and none of it feels exaggerated. That's the key. Even when the film pushes into more emotional territory, Gosling never overplays it. He keeps everything just restrained enough to feel real. It's not about big, dramatic speeches. It's about small reactions, subtle shifts. The way his expression changes when something clicks or when something goes wrong. He makes the science believable. He makes the isolation believable. And most importantly, he makes the stakes feel personal. Because if you don't believe in him, you don't believe in the mission. What's also impressive is how well he carries the film before any major interactions even begin. Those early sequences where he's essentially on his own could easily feel slow or empty in the wrong hands, but Gosling fills that space. He turns problem-solving into something engaging, almost suspenseful, simply through presence and timing. You're watching him think, react, adapt, and it never feels static. Then when the film begins to open up and he finally has something, or someone to play off of, you see another layer emerge. His natural charisma comes forward. His comedic timing sharpens, and suddenly, what started as a solitary performance becomes something more dynamic without losing its core. That balance is incredibly difficult to maintain. Too much humor, and the stakes disappear. Too much seriousness, and the film becomes heavy and inaccessible. But Gosling walks that line carefully, keeping the tone consistent while still allowing the character to evolve. And that evolution is what makes the performance stick. You don't just see Ryland Grace as a man on a mission. You see him as someone changing, someone adapting to circumstances he never wanted to be in, someone growing into a role he wasn't prepared for. By the end, it doesn't feel like you've watched a performance. It feels like you've been with him through every discovery, every setback, every moment of doubt, and that's why this role works. Because in a film that stretches across space, across time, across massive scientific ideas, Ryan Gosling keeps it grounded. He gives the story a face, a voice, a presence that holds everything together, even when everything else feels uncertain. And without that, Project Hail Mary wouldn't land the way it does. At the center of Project Hail Mary isn't just a mission. It's a man who never wanted to be part of it. Ryland Grace isn't introduced as a hero. He's not a fearless explorer, not a trained astronaut, not someone who spent his life preparing for the kind of responsibility placed on his shoulders. In fact, when you really look at him, he's the opposite of what you'd expect. He's a teacher, a scientist, yes, but someone who exists in a much smaller, more grounded world. A person who understands ideas, who explains them, who lives in curiosity rather than confrontation. And when he's pulled into something as overwhelming as a mission to save humanity, that contrast becomes the foundation of his character. Because Grace doesn't step forward with confidence. He hesitates, he questions, he resists. There's a very real sense, especially early on, that this is someone who doesn't believe he belongs in this situation, not because he lacks intelligence, but because he lacks certainty. And that uncertainty makes him feel human in a way that traditional sci-fi protagonists often don't. He's not driven by destiny, he's driven by circumstance, and that's what makes his journey compelling. As the story unfolds, both through his experiences in space and the gradual revelation of his past, we start to see the layers beneath that reluctance. This isn't just fear of the unknown, it's something deeper. A discomfort with responsibility, a resistance to being the one person everything depends on, and the film doesn't rush past that. It lets Grace sit in that discomfort. It lets him struggle with it. It allows moments where he doesn't feel heroic at all, where he feels overwhelmed, unsure, even unwilling. And those moments are crucial because they set the stage for what his arc ultimately becomes. This is not the story of a hero stepping into greatness. It's the story of someone growing into it, slowly, reluctantly, and often without realizing it. What's interesting is how that transformation happens. It's not triggered by a single event or a sudden shift in mindset. It builds over time, through problem solving, through connection, through the gradual understanding of what's at stake and what's required of him. Grace doesn't become brave because he decides to be. He becomes brave because he has to be, because the situation demands it, because there's no one else, because turning away is no longer an option he can live with. And that kind of bravery, quiet, reluctant, born out of necessity, feels far more authentic than the usual cinematic version. There's also an emotional dimension to his journey that deepens the character even further. His relationship with the people on Earth, the circumstances that led him to this mission, the weight of the choices made on his behalf, all of it adds complexity to how we see him. He's not just facing an external challenge. He's confronting what it means to matter in a situation where failure isn't personal, it's global, and that realization changes him. You start to see the shift. The hesitation begins to fade. The doubt doesn't disappear, but it transforms into something more focused, more determined. Grace starts to take ownership, not just of the mission, but of his role within it. And by the time you reach the later stages of the film, the difference is clear. He hasn't become a different person. He's become a fuller version of himself, still curious, still human, still uncertain at times, but now willing to act anyway. Willing to carry the weight, willing to make the kind of decisions that define not just the mission, but who he is. And that's what makes his arc resonate, because it's not about perfection, it's about growth. About stepping into something you never asked for and choosing in the end to see it through. Ryland Grace doesn't start as the man who can save the world, but by the time the story is over, you believe that he can. And then there's Rocky. Because for all the scale, all the science, all the existential stakes in Project Hail Mary, this film ultimately lives or dies on one incredibly risky idea. Can you make the audience emotionally connect with something completely alien? Not just unfamiliar, not just different, but something that at first glance shouldn't be relatable at all. And when Rocky is first introduced, that challenge is immediately clear. He doesn't look like anything we're used to. He doesn't behave like a human. He doesn't communicate in a way that's instantly understandable. There's an awkwardness to his presence, an intentional disconnect that makes you question how this dynamic is going to work. It takes adjustment. You don't instantly warm to him. You observe him. You try to figure him out just like Grace does. There's a distance there, a barrier that feels very real, and that's exactly what makes the eventual payoff so powerful. Because Rocky isn't designed to be instantly lovable, he becomes lovable, and that transformation is one of the film's greatest achievements. At first, he's a puzzle, a presence defined by logic, by unfamiliar patterns, by behaviors that don't align with human emotion. But slowly, through interaction, through shared problem-solving, through moments of trial and error, you begin to see something else emerge: personality. Not in the way we expect, but in a way that feels authentic to what he is. Rocky doesn't suddenly become human. The film doesn't force him into a familiar mold. Instead, it allows his character to develop on its own terms. His way of thinking, his way of reacting, even his way of expressing care, it all remains distinctly alien. And yet, you understand him. You connect with him. That's the brilliance of how he's written and realized. Because the film doesn't ask you to ignore the differences, it asks you to look past them. To find meaning in communication that isn't traditional, to recognize emotion in forms that don't resemble our own, and once that connection clicks, everything changes. Rocky stops being a concept and becomes a character. A presence with weight, with purpose, with a role in the story that goes far beyond novelty. He's not just there to add uniqueness, he becomes essential, not only to the mission, but to the emotional core of the film itself. There's also something fascinating about how he challenges the audience. We're used to aliens in cinema being either threats, mysteries, or reflections of humanity, but Rocky exists somewhere else entirely. He's not defined by conflict. He's defined by collaboration, by curiosity, by a shared goal that bridges the gap between two completely different worlds. And in that sense, he represents one of the film's central ideas. That understanding doesn't require sameness. That connection doesn't require familiarity, that even in the most unlikely circumstances, something meaningful can form. From a filmmaking perspective, the achievement is just as impressive. Rocky feels tangible, present, real in a way that never breaks immersion. Whether it's through performance, design, or the way he interacts with the environment, there's a consistency that allows you to accept him fully as part of this world. There's no moment where he feels like an afterthought, no moment where the illusion collapses. He belongs, and by the time the film reaches its emotional peaks, that initial awkwardness, the uncertainty, the distance, it's completely gone. Replaced by something much stronger: recognition, care, investment. You're no longer trying to understand Rocky, you're feeling for him, and that's not easy to achieve, because creating a character like this requires more than technical skill, it requires patience. Restraint, a willingness to let the audience come to the character, rather than forcing the character onto the audience. Project Hail Mary understands that, and because of it, Rocky doesn't just work, he becomes unforgettable. For all its scale, all its science, all its interstellar stakes, Project Hail Mary is, at its heart, a story about friendship. Not a conventional one, not an easy one, but one that ends up carrying the entire film. Because once Ryland Grace meets Rocky, the story shifts. What begins as a survival mission, isolated, tense, uncertain, suddenly becomes something more intimate, more human, even in the presence of something completely non-human. And that relationship becomes everything. At first, it's not a friendship at all. It's confusion. Two beings from entirely different worlds trying to make sense of each other. There's no shared language, no shared reference point, no guarantee that communication is even possible. Every interaction is cautious, experimental, filled with trial and error, and that's what makes it so compelling, because the film doesn't skip past that awkward beginning, it leans into it. You watch as understanding is built from nothing, through logic, through patience, through a willingness to keep trying even when it doesn't work the first time. It's not instant connection, it's constructed connection. And that process is where the bond begins. Slowly, the tension gives way to curiosity. Curiosity gives way to trust. And trust eventually becomes something deeper. What's remarkable is how natural that progression feels. There's no forced sentimentality, no sudden emotional leap that doesn't feel earned. Every step in their relationship is grounded in shared experience, problem-solving together, facing challenges together, learning from each other. They don't become friends because the story needs them to. They become friends because they've earned it. And once that connection is established, the tone of the film transforms. The isolation that once defined Grace's journey starts to fade. The silence of space is replaced with interaction, with rhythm, with something that feels almost comforting. Their conversations, however unconventional, bring warmth into a setting that would otherwise feel cold and empty. It becomes a kind of partnership, a collaboration not just of minds, but of perspectives. Grace brings curiosity, improvisation, emotion. Rocky brings logic, structure, a completely different way of understanding the world. And together they create something neither of them could achieve alone. That dynamic is where the film finds its identity. It's not just a sci-fi adventure anymore, it's a buddy story, a bromance even. But one that transcends the usual boundaries of the genre. Because this isn't about two similar people learning to get along. It's about two completely different beings finding common ground where none should exist. And that's why it resonates. Because beneath the science, beneath the spectacle, what you're really watching is connection forming in the most unlikely place imaginable. It's about recognizing intelligence, empathy, and purpose in something that doesn't look or think like you. It's about choosing cooperation over fear. And emotionally, that payoff hits hard. Moments that start off light, playful exchanges, small gestures, bits of humor, gradually take on deeper meaning. What once felt like simple interaction begins to carry weight. You start to care not just about the mission, but about what happens to both of them. Their success becomes shared, their risks become shared, and their fate becomes inseparable. By the time the story reaches its most intense and emotional moments, that bond is no longer just part of the film. It is the film. Everything revolves around it. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of tension is filtered through that relationship. And that's what makes it unforgettable. Because in a story about saving entire worlds, what stays with you isn't just the outcome, it's the connection. Two beings, two perspectives, one unlikely friendship that proves something simple but powerful. Even in the vast emptiness of space, you don't have to be alone. One of the most surprising things about Project Hail Mary is how funny it is. Because on paper, this story shouldn't be. We're talking about dying stars, a collapsing ecosystem, a mission that determines whether humanity survives or disappears, the kind of premise that usually leans into intensity, into pressure, into overwhelming seriousness. And yet, this film chooses something different. It chooses lightness, but not the kind that breaks the story, the kind that supports it. The humor in Project Hail Mary doesn't feel like an escape from the tension. It feels like a response to it, like the natural reaction of someone trying to process something far bigger than themselves. And that's why it works. It feels human. A lot of that comes down to how the humor is delivered. It's not built around punchlines or forced comedic beats. The jokes don't arrive with a spotlight on them, asking for laughter. They just happen, in the middle of confusion, in the middle of problem solving. In moments where the character is thinking out loud, reacting, trying to keep himself grounded. And because of that, the humor never feels disconnected from the story. It feels embedded in it. Ryan Gosling plays a huge role in making this tone land. His delivery is casual, unforced, almost accidental at times, the kind of humor that comes from personality rather than performance. You believe that this is how the character copes, with awkward observations, with dry reactions, with moments of levity that break the tension just enough to keep things from becoming overwhelming. But what really elevates the humor is how it evolves. When the story expands and new dynamics come into play, the comedy becomes more than just internal monologue or isolated reactions. It becomes interaction. A kind of back and forth that adds rhythm to the film. Moments that are light, playful, even slightly absurd at times, but always grounded in the reality of the situation. And that balance is crucial. Because the film never lets the humor take over, there's always a sense of weight beneath it. You're always aware of what's at stake. The jokes don't erase the danger, they exist alongside it. They make the characters feel more real, more relatable, more alive in a situation that could easily feel distant or abstract. In fact, the humor often makes the emotional moments hit harder. Because when you've been laughing with a character, when you've seen their lighter side, their quirks, their way of navigating the world, you become more invested in what happens to them. The shift from lightness to sincerity doesn't feel abrupt, it feels earned. The film understands that contrast. It knows that if everything is serious, nothing stands out, and if everything is comedic, nothing matters. So it finds that middle ground, a tone that allows both to coexist, where a moment of humor can sit right next to a moment of tension, where a light exchange can lead directly into something meaningful without feeling out of place. Of course, that approach won't work for everyone. Some viewers may feel that the humor softens the stakes too much, that it makes the film feel less intense, less grounded, less urgent. That in trying to be accessible, it sacrifices a certain level of seriousness, and that's a valid reaction. But for others, that lightness is exactly what makes the film stand out. It makes the story approachable. It keeps the pacing fluid. It turns what could have been a heavy, exhausting experience into something engaging, something that invites you in rather than pushing you away. Because at the end of the day, Project Hail Mary isn't just trying to impress you with its ideas. It's trying to connect with you, and sometimes the fastest way to do that is to make you smile, even when the universe is falling apart. For a film that spends so much time in isolation, Project Hail Mary understands something important. You can't fully appreciate the journey without understanding where it began. That's where the earthbound material comes in, because while the story in space is focused, contained, almost intimate in its execution, the flashbacks to Earth expand the world. They give context, they give weight. They remind you that this mission didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built, shaped, and in many ways forced into existence. And at the center of that world is Eva Stratt. She's not a typical supporting character. She's a force. Every time she appears, the tone shifts slightly. There's a sense of urgency, of control, of someone who sees the bigger picture and isn't willing to let anything, or anyone, stand in the way of solving it. She represents the reality of the situation in its most direct form. This isn't optional. This has to be done. And what makes her so effective is that she's not softened for the audience. She's decisive. She's pragmatic. At times, even intimidating. But that edge is exactly what grounds the story. In a film filled with wonder, humor, and emotional connection, she brings it back to something harsher, consequence. Through her interactions with Grace, you begin to understand the pressure behind the mission, the difficult choices, the moral lines that get blurred when the stakes are this high. She doesn't exist to comfort the protagonist. She exists to push him, to challenge him, to make it clear that the world doesn't have time for hesitation. And that dynamic adds depth, because Grace's reluctance, his uncertainty, his very human resistance, it all stands in contrast to Strat's unwavering determination. Together, they create tension, not through conflict for the sake of drama, but through fundamentally different ways of responding to the same crisis. One hesitates, the other acts. Beyond Strat, the Earth sequences introduce other figures, moments, and interactions that help shape Grace's journey. They add texture to his past, show glimpses of who he was before the mission, and hint at the kind of life he's leaving behind. There's humor here too, lighter exchanges, smaller character moments that break up the intensity. But even in those scenes, there's an underlying awareness of what's coming, of what's being built, and that's what these sequences really accomplish. They make the mission feel real, because without them, the story in space risks becoming too detached, too focused on the immediate, without fully understanding the cost of failure. The Earthbound material reminds you of what's at stake in a more grounded way. It connects the abstract idea of saving humanity to something tangible: people, decisions, sacrifices. That said, this is also one of the areas where the film receives mixed reactions. For some, these sequences are essential. They enrich the narrative, deepen the character, and provide a necessary counterbalance to the isolation of space. They give the story context, making every moment on the spacecraft feel more significant. For others, they feel underutilized. There's a sense that more could have been done, that the Earthside storylines, while effective, don't always reach their full potential. That certain elements could have been explored further, given more space to breathe, more time to develop. And that tension is interesting, because it highlights how important these sequences are to the overall experience. Even when they work, there's a feeling that they could have done even more. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, their purpose is clear. They anchor the film. They remind you that behind every decision in space, there's a world that made it necessary. A world filled with people who may never see the outcome, but whose fate depends on it. And in a story defined by distance, by isolation, by the vast emptiness of space, those moments on Earth bring everything back down. They give the mission meaning. They give it weight. They give it something to come back to, even when there's no guarantee anyone ever will. What makes Project Hail Mary work on such a large scale isn't just the story. It's the control behind it, because this is the kind of film that could easily fall apart in the wrong hands. It is everything that typically creates imbalance: huge scientific concepts, long runtime, tonal shifts between comedy and drama, and a narrative that moves between isolation and spectacle. And yet, under the direction of Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, it feels surprisingly cohesive. There's a clarity to their approach. They understand exactly what kind of film they're making, and more importantly, what kind of experience they want the audience to have. This isn't a cold, purely technical sci-fi film. It's not a chaotic, effects-driven spectacle either. It's something in between, a film that wants to feel big but also personal, and that balance is where their direction really stands out. From a structural standpoint, they handle the shifting timelines with confidence. Moving between past and present, between Earth and space, never feels confusing or disjointed. Each transition serves a purpose. Each scene builds on what came before it. There's a rhythm to the storytelling, a sense that everything is placed exactly where it needs to be to keep the audience engaged, never too far ahead, never too far behind. Even when the film slows down, even when it leans into explanation or character moments, there's always a sense of forward motion. That's not easy to maintain over a runtime like this, but the direction keeps it steady. At the same time, Lord and Miller bring their signature energy into the film, but in a more refined way than you might expect. The comedic instincts are still there. The timing, the lightness, the ability to find humor in unexpected places, it all carries over. But it's controlled. It never overwhelms the story. It never pulls the film into something overly exaggerated or tonally inconsistent. Instead, it's blended into the narrative in a way that feels natural, almost effortless. And that's key. Because the film constantly walks a tonal tightrope, it needs to be funny without becoming silly, emotional without becoming heavy, spectacular without losing its focus, and the direction keeps that balance intact. Visually, there's also a clear intention behind how the film presents itself. The scale is there. You feel the vastness of space, the isolation of the mission, the magnitude of what's happening. But it's never just about showing you something impressive. It's about placing the characters within that scale in a way that enhances the story. You're not just looking at space, you're feeling what it means to be inside it. And that comes from a careful combination of pacing, framing, and attention to detail. The film knows when to pull back and show you the bigger picture, and when to stay close, to focus on the human element at the center of it all. That sense of control extends to how the film handles its emotional beats as well. Nothing feels rushed, nothing feels overly stretched. The moments that need to land are given the time to do so. The story doesn't constantly push forward at the expense of its characters. It pauses when it needs to, allowing you to absorb what's happening, and then it moves again. That push and pull, that awareness of when to accelerate and when to hold back, is what keeps the film engaging across its entire runtime. There's also something notable about how the film positions itself within the larger landscape of blockbuster cinema. This isn't built on an existing franchise. It's not relying on familiar characters or pre-established worlds. And yet, it carries itself with the confidence of something that belongs in that space. It feels complete, self-contained, like a film that understands it needs to earn its audience rather than rely on recognition. And that's a reflection of the direction. Lord and Miller don't treat this as just another large-scale production. They approach it with a level of care that allows both the spectacle and the storytelling to coexist without one overpowering the other. Of course, no direction is without its criticisms. There are moments where the pacing may feel uneven, sections where the film lingers longer than necessary, choices that some viewers may find too safe, too polished, too focused on maintaining accessibility rather than pushing boundaries. But even within those criticisms, there's an acknowledgement of control. Nothing feels accidental. Every decision, whether you agree with it or not, feels deliberate, and that's what ultimately defines the filmmaking approach here. It's not about taking risks for the sake of it. It's about guiding a complex story with precision, keeping it grounded when it could drift, keeping it engaging when it could slow, and making sure that, no matter how big the film becomes, it never loses sight of what's at its center. At just over 2.5 hours, Project Hail Mary isn't a short film. And the moment you hear that runtime, there's an immediate question that comes to mind. Does it feel that long? The answer depends on who you ask, because pacing is one of the most divisive aspects of the film. For some viewers, it's one of its greatest strengths. For others, it's where the experience starts to lose momentum. And interestingly, both perspectives come from the same structure. The film opens with a sense of urgency. You're thrown into a situation that's already in motion. There's mystery, there's tension, there's a constant need to figure things out. It moves quickly, pulling you into the story without hesitation. Scene by scene, problem by problem, the narrative builds forward with a clear sense of direction. At this stage, the pacing feels tight, engaging, purposeful. You're not watching the clock, you're following the story. And for a significant portion of the film, that momentum holds. The blend of discovery, humor, and problem-solving keeps things moving. Even when the film slows down to explain something, it usually does so in a way that feels connected to the larger journey. But then the rhythm begins to shift. As the story progresses, especially into the middle and later sections, the pacing becomes more uneven. Certain sequences, particularly those focused on technical problem-solving or scientific trial and error, start to stretch longer than expected. And while these moments are important to the story, they can feel prolonged, not because they lack purpose, but because of how much time they take to unfold. You start to feel the weight of the runtime. Scenes linger. Solutions take longer to arrive. The forward momentum that defined the opening becomes less consistent, and for some viewers, that's where patience begins to wear thin. There's also an interesting structural issue that emerges toward the end. The film builds toward what feels like a natural climax, a moment where everything has been leading, where the tension peaks, where you expect the story to resolve. But instead of concluding there, it keeps going and going, introducing additional resolutions, additional moments that feel like endings. It creates a sense of repetition, not in content but in structure. You find yourself thinking, this could be the end, and then it isn't. For some, this extended final stretch adds emotional weight. It allows the story to fully explore its consequences, to give its characters space to land where they need to land. It feels complete, even generous in how much it gives the audience. For others, it feels drawn out, like the film is reluctant to let go. And that tension between fullness and excess is at the heart of how people experience its pacing. What's fascinating is that even with these criticisms, many viewers still find themselves fully engaged for most of the runtime. The film's core elements, its characters, its central relationship, its sense of curiosity, are strong enough to carry it through moments where the pacing dips. In other words, even when it slows down, it doesn't stop working, but it does change the experience. Instead of a consistently tight, high-momentum journey, the film becomes more variable. It has peaks and valleys. Moments that pull you forward, and moments that ask you to sit back and take your time. And whether that works for you depends on what you're looking for. If you enjoy detail, if you appreciate seeing processes unfold, if you're invested enough in the characters to stay with them through slower stretches, then the runtime may not feel like a burden at all. In fact, it may feel justified. But if you're expecting constant propulsion, if you want every scene to push the story forward at the same pace, then the length becomes more noticeable, more demanding, and that's the balance the film ultimately strikes. It chooses depth over speed. It allows itself to linger, to explore, to expand, even if that means testing the limits of its runtime. And for better or worse, that choice defines how the film feels from beginning to end. Editing is one of those things you don't always notice until you do. And in Project Hail Mary, it becomes one of the more quietly debated aspects of the film, not because it's consistently flawed, but because its choices are very noticeable at certain points. Especially early on, the opening stretch of the film has a very specific rhythm, fast, fragmented, almost restless. Shots move quickly, cuts come rapidly, scenes transition before they fully settle. And while this approach clearly has intention behind it, the effect can feel overwhelming. For some viewers, it works. It mirrors the confusion of the character, the disorientation, the sense of waking up in a situation you don't understand, where everything feels just slightly out of sync. The quick cuts, the brief shots, the lack of stillness, it all contributes to that feeling of instability. But for others, it's too much. Instead of enhancing the experience, it becomes distracting. The rapid pacing of the edits makes it harder to settle into the world, harder to absorb what's happening, harder to fully engage with the story in those early moments. It creates a kind of visual noise that competes with the narrative rather than supporting it, and that's where the criticism begins, because editing, at its best, should be invisible. It should guide you, not pull your attention away. It should create flow, not fragmentation. And when the cuts become noticeable, when you start thinking about how something is being edited instead of what's being shown, that's when the illusion starts to crack. What's interesting, though, is how this evolves as the film progresses. As the story settles, so does the editing. The pacing becomes more controlled, scenes are allowed to breathe, moments have space to land. The structure feels more cohesive, more fluid, more in line with the emotional and narrative rhythm of the film. It's almost as if the editing grows with the story. Early on, it's chaotic, uncertain, reflecting a lack of clarity. Later, it becomes more stable, more confident, more focused, and that shift does help, because once the film finds its rhythm, the editing largely stays out of the way. It supports the storytelling instead of interrupting it. Transitions feel smoother. The balance between past and present becomes easier to follow. The flow between scenes starts to feel natural rather than abrupt, but that initial impression doesn't disappear completely. For some viewers, those early choices leave a mark. They shape how the film is experienced from the start, and even if the editing improves, that first impression lingers. There's also a broader question here about how the film handles its structure, because beyond individual cuts, editing is about how the entire narrative is assembled, how scenes are arranged, how information is revealed, how the story moves from one moment to the next. And for the most part, Project Hail Mary handles this well. The intercutting between timelines feels intentional. The placement of flashbacks aligns with the character's memory. The progression of events builds logically. But again, that early choppiness introduces a slight imbalance. It's not enough to break the film, but it's enough to be noticed. And in a movie that otherwise aims for immersion, for emotional connection, for a seamless blend of science and storytelling, even small disruptions in flow can stand out more than they normally would. In the end, the editing in Project Hail Mary is a mix of bold choices and uneven execution. At its best, it enhances the story, guiding the audience through complex ideas, balancing multiple timelines, and maintaining engagement across a long runtime. At its weakest, it draws attention to itself, breaking immersion, disrupting flow, and creating moments where the storytelling feels less smooth than it could be. And that contrast is what defines it, because this isn't a film with poor editing. It's a film with noticeable editing, and sometimes that makes all the difference. At the heart of Project Hail Mary lies something that defines almost every moment of the film: problem solving, not action in the traditional sense. Not spectacle for the sake of spectacle, but a constant, ongoing process of trying to understand something and then figuring out how to survive it. This is a science-driven story, and it embraces that fully. From the very beginning, the film leans into its scientific foundation. Concepts are introduced, broken down, explored. The threat itself isn't just something abstract, it's something that needs to be understood, analyzed, and ultimately solved. And that means the audience is brought into the process. You're not just watching events unfold, you're watching ideas unfold. Experiments, hypotheses, failures, adjustments. It's a cycle, and it becomes one of the film's defining rhythms. Every obstacle isn't just a moment of danger, it's a question. And every question demands an answer that can only come through logic, through observation, through persistence. There's a real emphasis on the how of everything. how does this work? Why is this happening? What can be done about it? And when the film is at its best, that process is genuinely engaging, because it turns thinking into tension. Instead of relying solely on external threats, the film builds suspense through uncertainty, through the possibility that the next idea might fail, that the next solution might not be enough. That time might run out before understanding is achieved. You're not just waiting for something to happen, you're waiting to see if something can be figured out. That's a very different kind of engagement, but it's also where the film starts to divide audiences, because for every viewer who finds this approach fascinating, there's another who finds it heavy. The exposition is constant. Scientific explanations, biological concepts, technical details, they're woven into the dialogue throughout the film. And while the story makes an effort to present these ideas in an accessible way, there are moments where it feels dense, where the film slows down to explain rather than move forward. The early sections, in particular, spend a significant amount of time establishing the nature of the threat, the mechanics behind it, and the logic of the mission. And while that foundation is necessary, it can feel prolonged. You start to feel the weight of the information, not because it's uninteresting, but because of how much of it there is. And even later in the film, as the story shifts more toward action and interaction, that pattern doesn't completely disappear. The problem-solving sequences continue. The trial-and-error approach remains. And occasionally, those sequences stretch longer than they need to. But here's the trade-off. Without that depth, the film wouldn't feel the same. The solutions wouldn't feel earned. The stakes wouldn't feel grounded. Because what Project Hail Mary is ultimately doing is asking the audience to believe in the process, to believe that understanding something, no matter how complex, is the key to overcoming it. And that belief requires detail. It requires time. It requires explanation. So the film walks a fine line. On one side, it risks slowing itself down with too much exposition. On the other, it risks losing its credibility if it simplifies too much. And for the most part, it manages to stay balanced. Not perfectly, but effectively. Because even when the exposition becomes heavy, it's still tied to something meaningful. It's still connected to the larger goal. You're not just being told information, you're being shown why it matters. And when those pieces come together, when a solution finally works, when an idea clicks into place, the payoff is satisfying in a way that feels earned. You understand why it works, you've seen the effort behind it, you've been part of the process, and that's what sets this film apart. It doesn't just show you a solution, it shows you how it was found, step by step, mistake by mistake. Until eventually it works, or at least it gets close enough to keep going. And in a story where everything depends on understanding the unknown, that journey of discovery becomes just as important as the outcome itself. There are films you can watch anywhere, and then there are films that demand to be seen on the biggest screen possible. Project Hail Mary is firmly in that second category. Because from a visual standpoint, this isn't just a movie, it's an experience. From the moment the film opens up into the vastness of space, there's a clear intention behind every image. This isn't just about showing you something impressive. It's about making you feel the scale of it, the distance, the isolation, the overwhelming size of the universe compared to the small, fragile presence at its center. And that contrast is what defines the film's visual identity. On one side, you have the intimacy of the spacecraft, tight spaces, controlled environments, a sense of confinement that constantly reminds you how limited the character's world really is. Every surface, every piece of equipment, every corner of that ship feels lived in, functional, real. And then, just beyond it, endlessness. The film repeatedly pulls back to show you just how small everything is, stars stretching infinitely. Darkness that feels almost tangible, celestial bodies that dwarf everything around them. And in those moments, the scale isn't just impressive, it's humbling. You're not just looking at space, you're feeling what it means to be inside it. That's where the film's visual strength really lies, not just in how it looks, but in how it makes you perceive the world of the story. There's a sense of immersion that goes beyond simple spectacle. It pulls you into the environment, making you aware of both its beauty and its danger at the same time. And when the film expands its scope, when new environments, new systems, new visual elements are introduced, it leans fully into that sense of wonder. Everything feels carefully designed. Nothing feels random. There's a consistency to the visuals that suggests a clear vision behind it. Whether it's the way light interacts with surfaces, the way movement is handled in zero gravity, or the way different environments are distinguished from one another, there's a level of detail that reinforces the believability of the world. And that's important, because in a film built on scientific ideas and unfamiliar concepts, the visuals play a huge role in grounding the experience. They make the abstract feel tangible. They give shape to things that would otherwise be difficult to imagine. At the same time, the film never loses sight of its emotional core, the visuals aren't just there to impress, they're there to support the story. Moments of awe are balanced with moments of quiet. Grand, sweeping images are contrasted with smaller, more personal ones. The scale never overwhelms the character. It surrounds him, enhances his journey, but never replaces it. And that balance is what makes the spectacle feel meaningful, because it's not just about how big the film looks, it's about how that scale interacts with the story being told. Of course, the impact of these visuals is amplified even further in a theatrical setting. This is a film that benefits from size, from clarity, from immersion, from the kind of presentation that allows every detail to be fully appreciated. Large format screenings, especially IMAX, elevate the experience. They make the space feel deeper, the scale feel larger, the images feel more immediate. It becomes less like watching a film and more like being inside it. That's why so many viewers emphasize the importance of seeing it on the big screen, because while the story works on its own, the visual presentation adds another layer. It turns the film into something more than just a narrative. It becomes something you experience physically, visually, almost emotionally through its scale. And that's not something every film achieves, because creating spectacle is one thing. Creating spectacle that feels intentional, that feels connected, that enhances rather than distracts, that's something else entirely. Project Hail Mary understands that difference. It doesn't just show you the universe. It places you inside it, and then reminds you, again and again, just how vast it really is. If the visuals of Project Hail Mary give the film its scale, the cinematography is what gives it its soul. Because beyond the spectacle, beyond the stars, the ships, the vast emptiness of space, there's a very deliberate way this film chooses to show you its world, and that choice shapes how you feel every moment of it. From the very beginning, there's a clear contrast at play. On one side, you have the confined, almost claustrophobic interior of the spacecraft, tight framing, controlled lighting. A sense that everything is close, contained, and just slightly restrictive. The camera often stays near the character, reinforcing that isolation, not just physically, but emotionally. You're not observing from a distance, you're right there with him. And then the film shifts, it opens up. Suddenly the camera pulls back and you're confronted with the vastness of space, an environment that feels endless, silent, and almost overwhelming in its scale. The difference is immediate and striking. One moment you're inside something small and controlled, the next you're looking out into something immeasurable. That visual contrast becomes a language, a way of telling the story without words. The closer the camera is, the more intimate the moment feels. The further it pulls away, the more you're reminded of the stakes, of the distance, of just how alone the character really is. It's a constant push and pull between the personal and the infinite, and that balance is handled with precision. There's also a distinct texture to the image that sets the film apart. It doesn't feel overly polished or artificial. There's a weight to the visuals, a sense that light behaves naturally, that surfaces have depth, that the environment exists beyond what's immediately visible. Even in a setting as unfamiliar as deep space, there's a grounded quality to how everything is presented. It feels tangible, real in a way that's hard to describe but easy to recognize. And that texture plays a crucial role in immersion, because when you believe in the world visually, you're more willing to accept everything else that comes with it. The science, the concepts, the situations, they all feel more convincing when the image itself carries that level of authenticity. There's also a careful use of composition throughout the film. Frames are constructed in a way that guides your attention without feeling forced. The character is often placed in relation to his environment in ways that emphasize scale, isolation, or focus, depending on what the moment requires. Nothing feels random. Every shot seems to have intention behind it, and that intention extends to how the film handles transitions between different visual spaces. Moving from the interior of the ship to the openness of space isn't just a change in setting, it's a shift in feeling. The cinematography adjusts accordingly, allowing each environment to maintain its own identity while still feeling part of the same cohesive world. At times, the film even plays with the presentation itself. Subtle shifts in how the image is framed or expanded help reinforce the sense of scale, especially during key moments. It's not something that calls attention to itself, but it's something you feel. A quiet expansion of the visual field that makes certain scenes feel larger, more immersive, more impactful. And when combined with large format presentation, that effect becomes even more pronounced. The image stretches. The details become clearer. The sense of space deepens. It's not just about seeing more, it's about feeling more connected to what you're seeing. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the cinematography is how it never loses sight of the story. No matter how visually striking a moment becomes, it never feels disconnected from the narrative. The camera isn't just capturing beauty, it's capturing meaning. Every shot serves a purpose, whether it's building tension, reinforcing emotion, or simply placing you exactly where you need to be in that moment. That's what elevates it, because it's easy to create images that look good. It's much harder to create images that feel right, images that support the story without overwhelming it, images that enhance the experience without distracting from it, images that stay with you, not because they were loud or flashy, but because they were effective. And that's exactly what Project Hail Mary achieves. It doesn't just show you space. It shows you how it feels to be in it, close, distant, overwhelming, and somehow still personal at the same time. In a film like Project Hail Mary, where so much of the story exists in environments we've never seen and ideas we can't physically touch, the illusion has to be perfect. Because the moment it breaks, even slightly, the entire experience starts to fall apart. And that's where the film's production craft becomes absolutely critical. From the design of the spacecraft to the smallest details of its equipment, there's a level of care here that goes beyond surface-level realism. Everything feels built with purpose, functional, lived in, like it exists not just for the camera but for the world of the story itself. You can feel the weight of it, the way objects move, the way space is used, the way the environment reacts. It all contributes to a sense that this isn't just a set. It's a place the character has to survive in, navigate through, and depend on. And that grounding is essential. Because once the film establishes that level of physical believability, it can start to introduce things that are far less familiar without losing your trust. That's where the effects come in. The film relies heavily on visual effects to bring its world to life, space environments, scientific phenomena, alien elements, but what stands out is how integrated they feel. They don't exist separately from the physical world, they blend into it. There's no clear line where reality ends and effects begin, and that's exactly how it should be. When effects are working at their best, you don't think about them. You don't notice them as additions or enhancements. You accept them as part of the environment. And for the most part, Project Hail Mary achieves that balance. The visuals feel cohesive, consistent, designed with a clear understanding of how everything fits together. But the true test of that craft is Rocky, because Rocky isn't just another visual element. He's a character, and not just any character, a central one. A presence that the audience needs to connect with emotionally, not just visually, and that makes his realization one of the film's most important challenges. From a design perspective, he's unconventional. He doesn't resemble anything familiar. There's no easy reference point, no immediate recognition that helps you understand him, and that means the film can't rely on familiarity to make him work. It has to rely on execution. The way he moves, the way he occupies space, the way he interacts with the environment and with grace, every detail matters, and what's impressive is how tangible he feels. There's a physicality to his presence that grounds him. Whether it's the integration of practical elements, the precision of his movements, or the way light interacts with his form, there's a consistency that makes him feel like he's really there, not added in later, not separate from the scene, but part of it, and that's what allows the audience to accept him, not just as an idea, but as something real within the world of the film. Of course, not every viewer sees the effects the same way. While many praise the film's visual consistency and attention to detail, others point out moments where the illusion feels less convincing, where certain images don't match the overall quality, where the execution feels uneven. And that contrast is worth noting, because in a film that aims for such a high level of immersion, even small inconsistencies can stand out more than they normally would. When everything else feels so carefully constructed, any deviation becomes more noticeable. But even within that discussion, one thing remains clear. When it comes to Rocky, the film gets it right. Because his success isn't just about how he looks, it's about how he's integrated into the world, how he interacts, how he feels. By the time the story reaches its emotional peaks, you're not thinking about effects or design or technical execution. You're thinking about him, about what he represents, about what he means to the story. And that's the ultimate goal of production craft at this level, to create something so seamless, so convincing, that it disappears, leaving behind only the experience, only the connection, only the story. And in that sense, Project Hail Mary doesn't just use effects to build its world, it uses them to make you believe in it. There's a moment in Project Hail Mary where nothing major is happening on screen, no explosions, no urgent problem to solve, no dramatic confrontation, and yet you feel something shift. The scene expands, the emotion deepens. The weight of the moment becomes undeniable, and that's not coming from the visuals, it's coming from the sound, because one of the film's most powerful tools isn't what you see, it's what you hear. The score in Project Hail Mary doesn't just accompany the story, it elevates it. It acts like an emotional current running beneath the surface, guiding how you experience each moment without ever demanding your attention outright. At times, it's subtle, almost invisible, a quiet layer that supports the scene, adding just enough presence to shape the mood without overpowering it. You don't consciously notice it, but you feel it. It fills the silence. It gives weight to stillness. It turns simple moments into something more reflective, more intimate. And then, when the film needs it, the score rises. It expands with the visuals, matching the scale of what you're seeing while amplifying the emotion behind it. Moments of discovery feel more wondrous. Moments of tension feel sharper. Moments of connection feel deeper. It doesn't just mirror the scene, it enhances it. What's particularly effective is how well the music adapts to the film's shifting tone. This is a story that moves between humor, suspense, curiosity, and emotional sincerity, and the score follows that movement seamlessly. It never feels out of place. It never feels like it's pushing the film in the wrong direction. Instead, it adjusts, finding the right tone for each moment. When the film leans into its lighter side, the music supports that sense of playfulness without turning it into parody. When the tension builds, the score tightens, becoming more focused, more urgent, without overwhelming the scene. And when the emotional weight hits, that's where it truly stands out, because the score understands when to step forward, when to take a moment that's already meaningful and elevate it into something memorable. It doesn't force emotion, it unlocks it. It allows the audience to fully feel what's happening, to sit in that moment just a little longer, to connect in a way that goes beyond the visuals. There's also a strong relationship between sound and silence throughout the film. Space, by its nature, is quiet, vast, empty, and the film uses that to its advantage. It doesn't fill every moment with music. It allows silence to exist, to create contrast, to build anticipation, to make the return of sound feel more impactful. That restraint is important, because without it, the score wouldn't land the way it does. It's the difference between constant noise and meaningful sound, and Project Hail Mary understands that balance. It knows when to hold back, and it knows when to let the music carry the moment. Of course, like any aspect of the film, not every viewer will respond to it the same way. Some may find it less noticeable, less distinctive on its own. Others may feel that it blends so seamlessly into the film that it never stands out as a defining element. But that in itself speaks to its design, because this isn't a score trying to dominate the experience. It's a score trying to support it, and when it works, it does something subtle but powerful. It connects everything: the visuals, the performances, the emotion. It ties them together into a single, cohesive experience that feels larger than the sum of its parts. By the time the film reaches its most important moments, you're not just watching what's happening. You're feeling it, and a big part of that is the sound guiding you there. For all the science, all the spectacle, all the interstellar stakes, what Project Hail Mary is really building toward is a feeling. Because beneath the equations, beneath the mission, beneath the race to save humanity, this is a story driven by something far more personal: connection. From the very beginning, the film plants its emotional foundation in a simple idea. No one is meant to face the unknown alone, and everything that follows, every discovery, every challenge, every moment of tension, feeds back into that core theme. At first, it's subtle. You're watching a character deal with isolation, with uncertainty, with the pressure of being the only one left to figure things out. There's a quiet loneliness in those early moments, a sense that even in the vastness of space, what's missing isn't just safety. It's companionship, and that absence gives weight to everything. Because when connection finally does enter the story, when the dynamic shifts from isolation to interaction, it doesn't just change the tone. It changes the emotional trajectory of the entire film. What follows is more than just cooperation. It's understanding. Two beings, completely different in every way, learning not just how to communicate, but how to trust. How to rely on one another. How to exist in a shared space where neither fully understands the other, and yet both choose to keep trying. That choice becomes the heart of the film, because it reflects something deeply human. The willingness to reach across differences, to work together even when it's difficult, to see value in someone or something that doesn't mirror your own experience. And from that foundation, the film begins to explore something even deeper: sacrifice. Not the grand, performative kind, not the kind that exists purely for dramatic effect, but the quieter version, the kind that comes from understanding what's at stake and choosing to act anyway. It's not about being fearless. It's about doing something despite the fear. That's where the theme of bravery really takes shape. In Project Hail Mary, bravery isn't loud. It doesn't come with speeches or declarations. It emerges gradually through decisions, through moments where the character has to choose between comfort and responsibility, between self-preservation and something greater. And those choices carry weight, because they're not easy, they're not obvious. They're earned. There's also a strong sense of cooperation running through the film, not just between individuals, but as a broader idea. The notion that survival isn't about one person solving everything alone, but about working together, combining knowledge, sharing perspectives. It's a rejection of isolation, a reminder that even in the most extreme circumstances, progress comes from collaboration, and that idea extends beyond the immediate story. It becomes a reflection of what the film is trying to say about humanity as a whole, that our greatest strength isn't just intelligence or innovation, but our ability to connect, to adapt, to support one another when it matters most. All of these themes build steadily toward the film's final moments, and when it reaches that point, when everything comes together, when the story arrives at its emotional and narrative conclusion, the payoff feels complete. Not because it surprises you, but because it resolves everything the film has been building. The decisions feel logical within the story, the outcomes feel earned, and the emotional weight lands because it's been carried carefully from beginning to end. There's a sense of closure, not just in what happens, but in what it means. You're not just watching an ending, you're understanding it, and more importantly, you're feeling it, because by that point, the film has done something very deliberate. It's made you care about the mission, about the outcome, but most of all about the connection at the center of it all, and that's why the emotional payoff works. Because when the story finally reaches its conclusion, what stays with you isn't just whether the world was saved. It's what it took to get there, the trust, the sacrifice, the understanding, the simple, powerful idea that even in the most unlikely circumstances, connection can change everything. Endings are where films are judged the hardest. Because no matter how strong the journey is, if the landing doesn't work, everything before it starts to fade. And Project Hail Mary takes a very particular approach to its final act, one that, depending on your perspective, is either deeply satisfying or slightly overextended. What's clear is this: the film doesn't rush to the finish line. It builds toward it, carefully, deliberately. There's a point where the story reaches what feels like its natural climax, the moment where everything has been leading, where the tension peaks, where you expect the narrative to resolve and begin to close. And for a brief moment, it feels like that's exactly what's about to happen. But then the film does something unexpected. It continues. It pushes beyond that initial peak, extending the final act into additional territory, exploring consequences, decisions, and outcomes that go further than what a typical structure might allow. For some viewers, this is where the film truly shines, because instead of ending at the most obvious point, it chooses to follow through. It allows its story to fully play out, to examine what happens after the climax, to give its characters the space to complete their arcs in a way that feels thoughtful and complete. There's a sense of generosity to it, a willingness to not cut things short, to let the emotional beats breathe, to ensure that the resolution isn't just functional but meaningful, and when it works, it lands. The final decisions feel consistent with everything that's come before. The emotional payoff connects directly to the themes the film has been building. There's a logic to the ending, not just in terms of plot, but in terms of character. It feels earned, but at the same time, this approach introduces a different kind of tension, because that extended final act can also feel like too much. As the film moves past its initial climax, it begins to create a pattern, moments that feel like endings, followed by more story. Then another moment that feels like a conclusion, followed by more again. And for some viewers, that repetition starts to stand out. You begin to feel the length. You start to question whether the film needed to go this far, whether some of these additional beats could have been tightened, condensed, or even removed without losing impact. It's not that the content is unnecessary, it's that the structure becomes stretched. There's also a sense, for some, that the final act becomes slightly chaotic in its execution, not in terms of clarity, but in terms of pacing. Ideas, resolutions, and emotional beats come in quick succession, and the balance between them isn't always perfectly maintained. What was once controlled and deliberate can start to feel just a little rushed, or paradoxically, a little drawn out at the same time. And that's the core of the divide. Some see the ending as emotionally rich, complete, and deeply satisfying, a conclusion that honors both the story and its characters. Others see it as slightly overindulgent, an ending that lingers longer than necessary, repeating its sense of closure without adding enough new weight each time. But what's important is this: even in its most debated moments, the ending still carries meaning. It still connects back to the film's central ideas: sacrifice, cooperation, connection. It still reflects the journey the character has taken. It still feels like a conclusion that belongs to this story. And that matters, because even if the structure isn't perfect, even if the pacing wavers, the intention remains clear. The film wants to leave you with something, not just an outcome. Not just a resolution, but a feeling, a sense that what you've just watched has reached its natural endpoint, not just in plot, but in purpose. And whether you find that ending perfectly measured or slightly overstretched, there's no denying one thing: Project Hail Mary doesn't just end, it lingers. And for many viewers, that lingering, those extra moments, those final choices, is exactly what makes it stay with you long after the screen fades to black. For a film so deeply rooted in science, Project Hail Mary asks for a certain level of trust. It invites you into a world built on logic, on biology, on physics, on the idea that every problem has a solution if you understand it well enough. And for most of its runtime, it works hard to earn that trust, step by step, explanation by explanation. It builds a system that feels grounded, even when the ideas themselves are extraordinary. But no matter how carefully that system is constructed, there are moments where it starts to strain, moments where the logic doesn't feel as airtight as everything around it. And those moments stand out, not because they're constant, but because the film has trained you to expect precision. When a story leans this heavily into science, into cause and effect, into problem-solving as its central engine, the audience begins to look for consistency, for clear reasoning, for explanations that match the level of detail the film has already established. So when something happens that doesn't quite align with that expectation, it becomes noticeable. There are instances where certain plot mechanics feel underexplained, where outcomes rely on coincidence, or where the scale of what's being achieved stretches beyond what the film has fully justified. And in a narrative built on logic, even a small gap can feel larger than it actually is. One moment in particular highlights this. A sequence that hinges on locating something in the vastness of space, an environment defined by its scale, its emptiness, its near impossibility to navigate with precision. And yet the film moves through this moment quickly, without fully grounding how such a feat is realistically achieved. It's the kind of scene that, on paper, raises questions. How is this possible? What's guiding this? What information is being used? And when those questions don't have clear answers, it can pull you out of the experience, if only for a moment. But here's the interesting part. For many viewers, it doesn't matter. Because the film has already built enough goodwill. By the time these moments occur, the audience is already invested in the characters, in the mission, in the emotional core of the story. And that investment creates a kind of flexibility, a willingness to accept that not every detail will be perfectly explained. It's not that the logic is ignored, it's that it's forgiven. The strength of the narrative carries you past the gaps. You recognize the issue, but you don't dwell on it. You move forward with the story because what's happening emotionally feels more important than whether every scientific detail holds up under scrutiny. Of course, that balance won't work for everyone. Some viewers approach this kind of film expecting rigorous consistency from beginning to end. For them, even small lapses in logic can break immersion. They can create a disconnect between what the film promises and what it delivers, especially when the rest of the story has set such a high standard. And that's the challenge with a film like this. The more grounded and detailed it is, the less room it has for shortcuts. But at the same time, no story, especially one dealing with concepts this large, this complex, can account for everything. There are always going to be moments where narrative momentum takes priority over complete explanation, where the story moves forward, even if the logic isn't fully spelled out, and Project Hail Mary walks that line. Most of the time, it stays firmly grounded. Occasionally, it stretches, but it rarely collapses, because even when the logic falters slightly, the film remains anchored by something stronger, its characters, its relationships, its emotional core. So the question becomes less about whether every detail makes perfect sense, and more about whether the story still works in spite of it, and for many viewers, it does. There's a question that quietly follows Project Hail Mary from beginning to end. How original is it? Because on one hand, this film feels fresh, engaging, emotional in ways that stand out. It captures a sense of wonder and connection that makes it feel unique in the current landscape of blockbuster cinema. But on the other hand, there's something familiar about it, and that familiarity isn't accidental. The film clearly draws from a lineage of science fiction that has come before it. You can feel echoes of other stories in its DNA, stories about isolation, survival, human ingenuity, and the vast unknown. The structure, the tone, even certain narrative beats can remind you of films that explored similar territory. And for some viewers, that becomes a limitation. There's a sense that while the film is executed at a high level, it doesn't necessarily break new ground. That it refines existing ideas rather than reinventing them. That it follows a path we've seen before, just with a different combination of elements. It becomes less about discovery and more about variation. But here's where the conversation shifts, because originality isn't always about creating something entirely new. Sometimes it's about how you combine familiar ideas, how you execute them, how you present them in a way that feels engaging, cohesive, and emotionally resonant. And that's where Project Hail Mary finds its strength. It takes known concepts, space exploration, scientific problem-solving, human survival, and grounds them in something more personal. It reframes them through character, through relationship, through a tone that blends humor and sincerity in a way that feels approachable. It's not trying to redefine the genre, it's trying to connect within it, and for many viewers, that's enough. Because even if the building blocks are familiar, the experience still feels fresh. The pacing, the performances, the emotional core, they bring something new to those familiar structures. They give the film an identity that goes beyond its influences. It becomes less about where the ideas come from and more about what the film does with them. Of course, not everyone sees it that way. There are those who look at the film and see a collection of ideas that have been done before, elements borrowed from other sci-fi stories, assembled into something that feels polished but not groundbreaking. For them, the familiarity becomes harder to overlook. It creates a sense that the film is playing it safe, that it's choosing to stay within the boundaries of what works, rather than pushing into something more ambitious or unpredictable. And that perspective is valid, because in a genre known for innovation, for challenging ideas, for redefining how we think about the future, there's always an expectation of something new, something unexpected. But Project Hail Mary doesn't fully chase that. Instead, it focuses on execution, on delivering a version of this kind of story that works, that's engaging, that's emotionally satisfying. That's accessible to a wide audience without losing its core identity, and in doing so, it occupies an interesting space. It's not revolutionary, but it's not generic either. It sits somewhere in between, a film that understands its influences, embraces them, and builds on them in a way that feels confident, even if it doesn't always feel groundbreaking. So the question of originality becomes less about whether the film is entirely new and more about whether it feels worth experiencing, whether the familiarity enhances the comfort of the story or limits its impact, whether the execution elevates the material or simply refines it. And depending on what you value more, innovation or execution, your answer to that question might be very different, but one thing is certain. Project Hail Mary knows exactly what it is, and whether you see that as a strength or a limitation is what ultimately defines your experience with it. Every time a new sci-fi film comes out, it enters a conversation. Not just with the audience, but with the films that came before it, and Project Hail Mary is no exception. Almost immediately, it invites comparison. You can feel it while watching, the echoes of other stories, the familiar rhythms, the shared DNA with films that have already defined what modern science fiction looks like. And whether intentional or not, those comparisons become part of how people experience this film. Because depending on what you bring into it, you may see it very differently. For some viewers, Project Hail Mary sits comfortably alongside films like The Martian, a story driven by problem-solving, by scientific ingenuity, by a character using intellect and persistence to survive the impossible. There's a grounded, almost procedural approach to how challenges are tackled. It's about figuring things out, step by step. And if that's the kind of sci-fi you connect with, human, accessible, focused on solutions rather than spectacle, then this film feels right at home. It delivers exactly what you're looking for, with a tone that makes the science feel approachable and the journey feel engaging. But then there's another side of the spectrum. Viewers who approach science fiction looking for something more expansive, more abstract, more emotionally overwhelming, something closer to the experience of Interstellar or Arrival. Films that lean into existential themes, into awe, into the kind of storytelling that pushes beyond the immediate narrative. For those viewers, Project Hail Mary may feel different, not lesser necessarily, but more contained. More grounded, less interested in exploring the vast philosophical questions of existence, and more focused on the immediate, practical challenge of survival and understanding. And that distinction matters, because it shapes expectations. If you go into this film expecting something deeply introspective, something that constantly reaches for the unknown in a conceptual way, you might find it more straightforward than anticipated. But if you go in expecting a story that balances science with character, that keeps things engaging while still maintaining emotional depth, then it hits that balance more effectively. There are also moments where the film recalls other familiar structures, the isolation of a single character navigating an unforgiving environment, the gradual uncovering of a mystery, the introduction of an unexpected connection that shifts the tone of the story. These are elements that have appeared in different forms across the genre, and here they're reassembled, reinterpreted, presented in a way that feels both recognizable and distinct. That's where the film positions itself, not as something entirely separate from the genre, but as something that exists within it, a film that understands the audience it's speaking to and adjusts its tone accordingly. It doesn't try to alienate viewers with complexity. It doesn't demand deep familiarity with science fiction conventions. Instead, it opens itself up. It becomes a kind of bridge, something that can appeal to dedicated fans of the genre while still remaining accessible to those who don't typically engage with it at all. And that accessibility is key because it broadens the film's reach. It allows it to function on multiple levels, as a thoughtful sci-fi story for those who want to engage with its ideas, and as an entertaining, emotionally driven experience for those who simply want to connect with the characters and the journey. Of course, that positioning also invites criticism. For some, being accessible can feel like being safe, like staying within boundaries rather than pushing them, like choosing familiarity over risk. But for others, it's exactly what makes the film work. It's what allows it to resonate with a wider audience, to bring together different expectations and still deliver something that feels cohesive. So when you compare Project Hail Mary to the films around it, the question isn't just, is it better? It's what is it trying to be? Because it's not trying to replicate those films. It's finding its own place among them, a place where science meets emotion, where scale meets intimacy, where familiarity meets execution, and depending on what you're looking for when you sit down to watch it, that place might feel exactly right. There's a certain kind of film that tries to challenge you, to push boundaries, to demand your full attention, your patience, your willingness to engage with something difficult or unconventional. And then there's another kind of film, one that invites you in. That's where Project Hail Mary sits, because for all its science, all its scale, all its complexity, this is, at its core, an incredibly accessible movie. It's designed to be understood, to be enjoyed, to be shared, and that accessibility is one of its defining traits. From the way the story is structured to the way information is delivered, the film consistently makes an effort to bring the audience along. Scientific concepts are explained in ways that don't feel overly intimidating. The emotional beats are clear without being simplistic. The tone balances seriousness with humor in a way that keeps things engaging rather than overwhelming. You're never left behind, you're guided, and that makes the film easy to recommend. It's the kind of movie you can suggest to almost anyone, whether they're a longtime fan of science fiction or someone who rarely watches the genre at all. It doesn't rely on prior knowledge. It doesn't expect you to fill in gaps. It meets you where you are and builds from there. There's a certain comfort in that, a sense that the film isn't trying to exclude anyone. It's not trying to be obscure or overly niche. It wants to connect with as many people as possible, and it shapes itself around that goal. For some viewers, that's a major strength. It makes the film feel welcoming, approachable, even safe in a way that allows you to settle into the experience without resistance. You can sit back, follow the story, connect with the characters, and let the film carry you through its world without having to work too hard to keep up. It becomes a shared experience, something that works across different age groups, different levels of familiarity with the genre, different expectations of what a sci-fi film should be. It's the kind of story you can watch with family, recommend to friends, revisit without hesitation. But that same accessibility also introduces a different kind of conversation. Because for others, it can feel like the film is playing things a little too safe, that in trying to appeal to everyone, it avoids taking bigger risks, that it smooths out its edges, keeps its tone controlled, and stays within boundaries that make it widely enjoyable, but perhaps less daring. There's a sense that it doesn't push as far as it could, that it prioritizes comfort over challenge, and that's where the divide begins, because what one viewer sees as approachable and inviting, another might see as restrained. What feels like clarity to some can feel like simplicity to others. What feels like balance can feel like compromise. But that doesn't change what the film is aiming for. It's not trying to be inaccessible. It's not trying to alienate. It's trying to connect, to bring together large ideas and present them in a way that feels human, understandable, and emotionally engaging. To create a story that can be appreciated without needing to decode it. And in that sense, it succeeds. Because even with all its science, all its scale, all its ambition, it never forgets the audience. It never loses sight of the idea that, at the end of the day, a film like this isn't just about what it says, it's about who it reaches. And Project Hail Mary reaches far, not by being the most complex, not by being the most daring, but by being something just as important, something people can connect with. So after everything, the performances, the visuals, the science, the pacing debates, the emotional core, where does Project Hail Mary actually land? Because this is where all those elements come together. And interestingly, despite the variety of opinions surrounding specific aspects of the film, the overall verdict leans in a very clear direction. This is a film that works, not perfectly, but powerfully. Across the board, there's a strong sense that Project Hail Mary delivers on what it sets out to do. It's engaging, it's emotionally resonant, it's visually impressive. And above all, it's anchored by a central performance and relationship that carry the entire experience. Even when people point out flaws, and there are a few that come up consistently, they rarely overshadow the bigger picture. Because the positives are doing a lot of heavy lifting, Ryan Gosling's performance is widely seen as the backbone of the film. The emotional connection between the characters becomes the driving force. The visuals create a sense of scale that elevates the experience. The humor keeps things accessible. The themes give it meaning. And when all of that comes together, it creates something that feels complete. That's the key word here, complete. Not groundbreaking, not flawless, but complete in a way that satisfies. Of course, the criticisms are still there, and they're worth acknowledging. The pacing can feel uneven, especially in the middle and toward the end. The editing, particularly early on, can feel choppy. Some plot elements raise questions that aren't fully answered. And depending on your expectations, the film's familiarity or accessibility might feel like a limitation rather than a strength. But what's interesting is how those criticisms are framed. They're not deal breakers, they're qualifiers. They exist alongside a general sense of enjoyment rather than replacing it. People may point them out, may even be bothered by them, but they don't necessarily define the experience, because the film's strengths are consistent. They're present from beginning to end. And for most viewers, they outweigh the weaker elements. There's also a noticeable pattern in how people describe their reaction. Words like entertaining, heartfelt, engaging, fun, and emotional come up again and again. It's not just about appreciating the film, it's about feeling something while watching it, and that's what gives the film its staying power, because when a movie connects on that level, it tends to linger. It becomes something you think about after it ends, something you remember not just for what happened, but for how it made you feel. At the same time, there's room for disagreement. Some viewers see it as one of the standout sci-fi experiences in recent years, something that deserves recognition, maybe even awards consideration. Others see it as a well-made but ultimately familiar film that doesn't quite reach the heights of the genre's best. And that divide is important, because it shows that the film isn't universally defined by one reaction. It exists in a space where different perspectives can coexist, where appreciation doesn't require perfection, and criticism doesn't erase enjoyment. So when you step back and look at the full picture, Project Hail Mary emerges as something very specific, a film that succeeds not by being flawless, but by being effective. By delivering a story that engages, characters that connect, and an experience that feels worth the time you invest in it. It may not redefine science fiction. It may not satisfy every expectation. But it does something that matters just as much. It works. And for a film of this scale, this ambition, this complexity, that's no small achievement. One of the most subtle but crucial elements of Project Hail Mary isn't the mission. It's the memory, because when we first meet Ryland Grace, he doesn't just wake up alone in space, he wakes up without himself. There's no immediate clarity, no understanding of who he is, why he's there, or what he's supposed to do. Just fragments, instincts, a lingering sense that something is wrong but no clear way to define it. And that absence becomes a narrative tool, because instead of telling you the story outright, the film lets you rediscover it alongside him. Every piece of information doesn't arrive as exposition, it arrives as realization, a memory returning, a detail clicking into place, a moment of confusion turning into understanding. And that process becomes one of the most engaging aspects of the film's structure. You're not just watching events unfold, you're watching identity rebuild itself, and that creates a unique kind of connection. Because as Grace begins to understand his situation, so do you. There's no gap between the character and the audience, no moment where he knows more than you do or where you're ahead of him. You're aligned, moving through the story at the same pace, uncovering the same truths. That shared perspective makes everything feel more immediate, more personal, because every revelation matters. Not just in terms of plot, but in terms of character. Each memory that returns adds another layer to who Grace is. You start to see the decisions that led him here, the circumstances that shaped him, the pressure, the hesitation, the choices, both his own and those made for him. And gradually a picture forms, not all at once, but piece by piece, and that pacing is important. Because if everything were revealed too quickly, the emotional impact wouldn't land the same way. The film takes its time, allowing each memory to surface at the right moment, when it can deepen the story, when it can reframe what's happening in the present. It turns backstory into progression. Instead of stopping the narrative to explain the past, it integrates the past into the present. Each recovered memory doesn't pause the story, it pushes it forward. And that keeps the film constantly evolving. You're always learning something new, always gaining a clearer understanding of what's at stake, not just for the world, but for the person at the center of it all. There's also something thematically significant about this structure. because as Grace regains his memory, he's not just remembering facts, he's confronting who he is, the kind of person he was, the kind of person he's becoming. And the gap between those two versions becomes part of his journey. It's not just about recalling the past, it's about reconciling with it, understanding it, and ultimately deciding what to do with that knowledge. Of course, this approach requires balance. If the memory retrieval feels too slow, it can drag. If it feels too convenient, it can lose its impact. And for some viewers, there may be moments where the timing of these revelations feels uneven. But when it works, it adds depth. It turns a straightforward mission into something more layered, more introspective, more engaging on a character level. Because by the time the story reaches its later stages, you're not just watching someone try to save the world. You understand how they got there, why they're there, and what it means for them to continue. And that's the power of this element. It doesn't just fill in the gaps. It transforms the journey from a mission of survival into a rediscovery of self.